Hello, welcome back. Let's just dive right back into a relaxed alternative to all that which Mr. Nathan has been discussing for 40 minutes.
Fortunately, there is an alternative way to interpret Quine's dictum that to be is to be the value of a bound variable that doesn't lead to the pickle I've just described. And, incidentally, is the view to which Quine...
That's again, a little common. Quine's dictum, how to interpret, well, then this is about, an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation, or, a way to criticize this is, as it usually is when people are doing philosophy, it strands on semantics. What do you mean? And why do I need to explain this? And why do I need to define that? And why do I need to argue for this? Or is it logic? Or, it ends up in you're sort of getting lost in your toolbox, right? And throwing around the tools and saying, "Oh, I think I've done something," right? And then, using a hammer there and a saw there and, whatever, right? It seems basically useless. It's this feeling that I usually get when I listen to presentations like this. It gets decoupled from anything that I would call a normal everyday scenario. Not like you can't abstract yourself a bit and discuss something but it feels more like it's all about getting disconnected from any ordinary everyday scenario and then never coming back. Getting lost in all sorts of semantics and discussions and whatever, right? Discourse and imaginations, abstractions and so on. And never coming back. But back there is where you live, so to say, right? You live in that everyday direct experience. And that's where my philosophy is being applied, right? So if somebody else presenting their philosophy don't get back to something that sort of is applicable, then why would I sort of care about it, right? But as I made a video recently, what WTF do these philosophers think they're doing? Right? Well, where does it all lead? Are you not interested in getting to something that you can use to something? Or is it merely just to be a part of the discourse rather than getting to a result that is functional, right? It's akin to somebody, trying to invent something but never getting to anything tangible, right? Yes, I'm still, after 40 years, I'm still inventing this thing, right? That should be applicable in my life. But, yes, I'm trying to invent this transportation, instrument, right? How long? Yeah, I've been doing it for 40 years, right? Yes, now I've been walking all the time, but I like being an inventor. Well, how about getting to a result at some point, right? Okay, I think you get my drift, right?
Quine himself was eventually led. Under this alternative interpretation, rather than think that what you talk about in your theory has some deep ontological commitment with great implications for what exists, you can turn it around and say that there's nothing really to existence other than being something you happen to talk about in a given theory. The correspondence relation still holds.
So now we're approaching some kind of definition of what it means to exist. Exist is apparently to him something you talk about. So if you don't talk, it doesn't exist. That's what is implied in his statement here, right? I don't like this. What do you call that? There's sort of a saying in Danish, but that doesn't. It's not it doesn't. There's not an English equivalent, I think. Maybe there is, but sort of when you're trying to approach the problem and then back off, right? And then approaching a bit and then backing off, right? So from this angle, oh no, I'm backing off, right? So it looks like you're, somebody. What would it be, right? Some procrastination kind of philosophy, right?
Kind of, but the order is reversed. Talk about what you like in your theory, it doesn't really matter. Sure, you're committing to the existence of these things, but that isn't a commitment deserving of much weight. Existence is a thin, derivative notion, a mere byproduct of a theory's way of speaking. You choose a theory because it's the most insightful way to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. And questions of what exist can only meaningfully be posed within a theory by those that already adopt that theoretical framework. There are then no questions about what ultimately, really, or absolutely exists. So what is this?
But then you're it's not begging the question. You're appealing to some question that I'm not sure you want to. It's sort of this. Well, you might want to answer this question. Well, okay, but are you going to answer the question or what? Right? You could answer this question. You could answer that question, right? And there's some interesting questions, but it's very thin. You probably can't get to the answer, and it's this sort of middle of the road kind of annoying polemicness, right? I'm not sure if polemic is the right term, but it's all about sort of just, buzzwords. It doesn't seem to get anywhere. We are past the 40-minute mark now, and this relaxed alternative, maybe it comes in the next part here, right? But how to count things? How to count things? Is that the penultimate chapter here, right? And then bringing it all together. So we're spending 6 minutes on how to count things. Is that the second to last step, or the last step before bringing it together when you're doing a case for idealism? Counting things? I mean, I am baffled about this guy at this point, right? What is he doing, man, right?
Alternative perspective mean? It means that electrons exist, physically speaking, just as DNA exists, biologically speaking. But then God exists, theologically speaking, and perhaps even Frodo exists, Lord of the Rings speaking.
Come on, man! After 40 minutes, would you please give me a definition of something now? Have you settled on anything here, right? It could be you could just get to the very ground floor and say, okay, at least I can say this. Okay, so far, so good, right? Okay, let me take the next step. And the next step I'm going to take because of this step prior or something like that. This sort of throwing around terms and talking about Frodo after 41 minutes. Frodo might exist in one way, but in another way, Frodo doesn't exist. And, man, right?
The moral is to relax about existence and to ask better questions.
What? So in order to do any kind of philosophy, you need to ask a question. Hey, somebody, ask a question. Otherwise, I can't philosophize about existence. I mean, maybe it's not as complicated as it's made out to be, right? If you're in a mindset that says, oh my fucking God, after 5 years of, however long it takes, of university philosophy, right? I have been, my mind is almost exploding with all sorts of philosophers who have said this, that and the other, and have to balance everything. So I can't actually get to anything because I'm going to ram my head against somebody who says something opposite that. That's one of the problems with these academics. They are being gaslighted into confusion on a higher level and being indoctrinated into thinking that philosophy is so difficult that it's basically impossible to do, right? but because they are academics, they have a small chance of getting somewhere, just a tiny, itsy bitsy, teeny weeny, right, way of philosophy, while the peasants down there, they're completely oblivious to any kind of philosophy. So I guess us confused academics, we have to do something at some point, right? Somebody ask a question so I can do some philosophy of existence. Frodo, are you there?
The better question I'm going to ask at this point is that if we adopt this thin notion of existence I'm suggesting, what does that tell us about the nature of existence, objects, and facts?
Okay, let me clarify my stance on this, right? Just to, cut the weed a bit and so we can get a clear view, right? My ontology is fairly simple. There's maybe some deeper complexity to it, but there's three major categories in my ontology. There are the qualia, which are the 5 sensual qualia: color, sound, taste, smell, and touch, right? And from that, if I have these, I might cognize something among these qualia, like elephant, for instance, right? Or bicycle, or apple, or Nathan Hawkins, right? Or YouTube, maybe, right? There might be some gray area where, so these kinds of cognitions like elephant and so on, but you say, well, is this a cognition or isn't it a cognition? Is it not a cognition? Maybe that's up to you or up to me to decide for myself what I'm going to go with, right? But at least I can identify or cognize something like elephant or apple, right? And from these cognitions, because when I look around in my experience, everything seems to be cognized. There's no part of this scenario I'm in right now that isn't cognized somehow. There's a wall, there's a window, there's a curtain, there's I don't know what it's called, but there's something lying in my window, an owl is made in cement actually, and some glasses and a book and my keyboard and a computer. No matter where I look, it's all cognized somehow, right? So what I'm saying is there's a plethora of qualia that are then, as a user interface, so to say, is cognized also with a layer on top of that, so to say, in sort of a mental representation, right? Like a screen, you could say, right? All these are cognized, but it doesn't mean that red is, for instance, specific to whatever is over there that is red. There might be something red over here also, but it might be a different cognition. But the cognition of this glass, a glass is a glass, right? Either it's a glass or it's not a glass. But whether it's red or not, that's a different story. Because there's a difference between the category of qualia and the category of cognitions. But because everything is cognized, in my opinion, then what comes from the next category is some kind of sort of, I get an emotion, I get a feeling, I get some abstraction or an idea, or I identify a pattern like, gravity, whatever, right? These are all what I categorize in one big lump as abstractions, right? Philosophy is an abstraction. An external world is an abstraction, right? Everything I can possibly derive from these cognitions are abstractions of some kind. Abstractions might be used in other connections by other people, but I have just lumped them into this big category called abstractions because they are all, in my opinion, dependent on some kind of cognition at some point, right? Okay, so you have A, qualia, B, cognitions, C, abstractions, right? At least that's one approach. It works for me so far, right? So what you have in front of you there, those are cognitions. These are category B, right? Cognitions, apple. That's an apple. Either it's an apple or it's not an apple. If you cognize apple, it's an apple, right? Does the apple exist? What do you mean exist? if I cognize apple, I cognize apple. I could call it that it exists, but what would it mean? Right? I'm not really interested in some deeper understanding of the apple. What do I need to eat the fucking apple or do whatever I need to do with the apple? I need to cognize it. If it's not an apple, I'm not eating it or treating it as an apple. If I cognize poodle dog, I'm not going to make an apple pie out of it, right? So, what does it mean that it exists? Well, if I cognize apple, that apple exists, right? Do you mean, well, is there some appleness beyond the apple, the cognition apple, or the concept apple, which is responsible for the cognition? That there's really something beyond the apple that I'm experiencing, but what I'm experiencing is not the actual so-called apple, whatever it may be. I call it apple because that's the name of my experience of it. Okay, fair enough. But then you can't get to that external world then. Because you have to experience something, right? The qualia. And if it's a qualia, it's not out there, right? And if it's not a qualia, you don't have access to it. So you can treat it as if it's a representation of something beyond your experiences, but you're never going to get to it. And all your fabulation about how it's composed and where it is and what it's like and all that doesn't really matter, because all you have access to is that empirical access to the cognition apple. That's what you have to work with. That's what I would call existence. Otherwise, why would I care about existence if it's not the actual cognition I am having an everyday experience of, right?
Well, to consider this question further, I've got an object lesson. How many objects?
This is a lesson. Listen carefully, little peasants out there, as these three things are apples.
Are there in front of me? You might think the answer is simple. There are three, of course. 1, 2, 3. But in philosophy, nothing is that simple. Some might argue there are, in fact, 7 objects in front of me. There's this object, and that object. Then there's the object you get by combining these two.
No. There is one object, point, apple, or point, apple, or point, apple. If you are simultaneously experience the same kind of concept in a different spatial position than the one you're pointing to, right? If 2 apples suddenly is not cognized anymore, you could point to 1 apple, right? You don't know in the next second whether or not you're going to still cognize 3 apples or 2 apples or 1 apple or whatever you would call it, right? But 3 is a part of your abstractions, right? You point and say apple, point and say apple, or point and think apple, or point, right? You don't even have to point, right? If you're not going to agree with somebody about it, you know, apple, 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 right? And if you say apple mentally 3 times, you say there's 3 apples, right? And the quantification is interesting because if you want to survive, possibly 3 apples is better than 1 apple, right?
These two, and the one by combining these two. That makes 6 objects. And then you have to add the 7th object, which is the object you get by combining all 3.
No. You can't combine object and get a new object, right? This is... I don't know why he is this so far out, right? This is ridiculous. So, how would you go about doing that down in the grocery store, and you have grabbed apple, and apple, put it in a bag, and then go to and say, are there 3 apples in this bag? No, there's actually 7 objects made out of 3 apples. Would they look at you like you're fucking crazy or what? I mean, yeah, nothing in philosophy is this simple. No, if you have to make it fucking complicated, no, of course it isn't simple. But you're overcomplicating it. You're overstretching. What you are letting rip of your imaginations here, right? You're going into abstraction land and imagination land and think that's where the solution to philosophy is, right? This, pathetic little apple. Who cares? No, that's actually 1 + 1 + 1 + 2 + 2 + 3 plus 4, and there's actually 7 objects here, right? Philosophers, man.
Together. Others would argue there must be at least 6 objects because there's this half and this half, there's this half and this half, this half and this half. That makes 6 apple half objects. But then apples can be halved in many ways, which means there must be...
There's an infinite number of...
lots of objects. What I'm getting at here is a question of Mereology.
Yeah, but until you cognize it, you can imagine all sorts of shit, right? But you don't cognize half an apple. You cognize apple, 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 right? All this shit you add to the story is not a part of existence. That's your imagination running wild, right? Fucking yourself up so you don't have to get to an answer to anything here, right?
Which is the philosophy of parts and wholes. If an object has parts, those parts must also be objects. And if objects combine into a whole, that whole must also be an object too. Now, if you think reality has a certain structure to it, you think there must be...
So, did we get a definition of what is meant by object? I don't think so, right? I mean, what does it take? If you take a little piece out of an elephant, is that also an elephant or what? It's just some weird piece, right? If I took a part of an elephant and, carried it over to you, would you say, hey, elephant, right? This is sort of why I think it's very important that you get away from the idea of authoritarian approach to these things. It has to be settled. This is how it's supposed to be understood. No. You could agree with somebody that there's 7 apples there, right? Or 7 objects. If you can agree with somebody there's 7 objects, knock yourself out, right? I wouldn't work with you, right? If I was working in a fruit store or a grocery store and you're talking about 7 objects there, I would say, okay, why don't you take your medicine? Or you're not hired anymore, right? So, but if you could find some grocery store where you can work and sell these 7 objects, right? You can make a lot of money possibly, right? Turn 3 apples into 7 apples, just like Jesus. Or something like that. But it's about agreement, about the experience. At some point, you have to agree with somebody on something, right? So if this is what you want to go with, Mr. Nathan Hawkins, okay, be my guest. I'm not going that route, I can tell you, right?
A definitive answer to how many objects there are. There must be, because reality contains a certain structure, which means there must...
But what is reality? You keep referring to something you haven't defined what is. Reality is like this, and it does that, and it is composed like this, and right? How? Okay, but how did you get to that? It's like everybody knows this, but we can really fuck up the idea of how many objects there are in front of me. But of course, there's a reality somewhere that is cut in stone, right?
Must be a certain number of objects in that structure. That's what a real structure is. But as Peter van Inwagen expertly lays out in his book Material Beings, it turns out to be very difficult to say when objects combine into other objects in a way that matches our intuitions.
But fuck your intuitions. Well, what are you cognizing? When you look at the table and point in a certain direction, what are you cognizing there? Point and tell me what you're cognizing. Are you cognizing apple? Then there's an apple. If you're cognizing poodle dog, then there's poodle dog, right? It doesn't matter what you think you should experience, or you shouldn't experience, or how many objects you think you're supposed to think there is. What are you experiencing in that particular aspect of your spatial experience, right? What are you cognizing? Point, apple, point, apple, point, apple, right? That's it. That's what you need, right? You had the idea, I'm going to, you didn't say to yourself, I'm going to find 7 objects somewhere. No, you had an idea, I'm going to buy some apples. I'm going to grab this apple, and this apple. And I'm going to bring them home. Probably you paid for them some kind of payment, right? And then slap them on your table. 1, 2, 3, right? And now you're sitting there, maybe there are 7 objects, right? Did you pay for 7 objects at the grocery store? I mean, it's crazy, man, right?
By far the most popular Mereological positions in philosophy are Mereological nihilism and Mereological universalism. And these two positions represent...
Oh my gosh, Mereological? I have never heard that word before, right? Mereological? Oh my god, I can name drop, right? Look, mommy. And it can be nihilist or universal. These academics, man.
Present the extremes. The Mereological nihilist says that objects never combine to form new objects, and objects don't have proper parts either, so all objects are simple.
But you're talking about this as if whatever experience you have all of a sudden access to some object that your experience or your cognition of apple, for instance, is representing, and that is what you're discussing, whether or not it exists or not. Well, that you can never get to. First of all, because that external world, in my opinion, is a pure imagination, right? Even if it's there, you can only imagine it. So you can never check if it's there, or you can even less go there, right? So if you're working from the idea of an external world, then that external world must be external to your experiences. Otherwise, what the hell do you mean then by an external world, if that's what you're pointing to, right? And if you're working from an external world, that has to be an axiom. It cannot be argued, because what would it be, that argument? I have some colors, therefore something beyond my colors. And you can do the same for sounds and taste and touch and smell. There's nothing about your qualia that must lead to the conclusion that there's something beyond or before these qualia. You can't get to it. It's a one-way street, the other way, right? You cannot force your way through your qualia to get to the other side of qualia, right? If there's something beyond qualia. I mean, you can work from the idea that there is, but you can never get to what it is. And you can only get to an idea of it. You can never get to it. So if this is what you're discussing, well, you're discussing something you can never get to, right? You can do this and you could do that, and then it could be this and it could be that, and it could be this Mereological nihilism, Mereological universalism. Who cares? Do you need to do all this to take a bite of that apple? Right? If it wasn't half an apple, it would still be apple, just half apple, but it's still apple, right? Isn't that sufficient for you to, survive? Don't expect, of course, you're going to live off apples the rest of your days. But it's this unnecessary complication and confusion of what we are dealing with, where it seems these academic philosophers who have never been out in any real life and done some manual labor of any serious kind, possibly, right? They're living in these abstractions. That's where it is. Philosophy is very difficult, right?
The Mereological nihilist typically thinks that the simple objects in reality are the fundamental particles of standard model physics. So it's Mereological nihilists that want to do things like switch talk of computers and tables into talk of particles arranged computer-wise and table-wise. Mereological
No, but if you keep going like this, you shouldn't eat any apples because you don't know what the hell it is, right? There's an object there, right? You don't even know there's 3 or 7 objects. So how can you fucking eat it, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm going to fancy philosophy. Okay, done the video, and then he grabs this fucking apple and takes a bite of it, right? And then all these 7 objects are forgotten. It gets back to some kind of ordinary everyday where an object is an object, an apple is an apple, and the other apple is another apple, right?
Universalists, on the other hand, are at the other end of the spectrum.
And I might point out that, and this is why there is a problem with these academic philosophers, because they stay in this, whenever you hear them talk, they stay in this abstraction land and confusion land and complication land, where everything is so complicated that they can't even find a way out of the plastic bag, right? So no wonder nobody's getting anywhere. They're only complicating shit and making it even more difficult to find a way out of the plastic bag or paper bag, right?
They argue that objects always combine to form new objects. So sure, there are computers and tables, but then there are much weirder objects as well, such as this apple, Shakespeare's favourite quill, the fourth moon of Jupiter, and your socks. Given that according to ontological realism, at most one of the Mereological nihilist and Mereological universalist can be right, philosophers on either team battle it out. Mereological nihilists argue that there can't possibly be things like computers and tables, while the Mereological universalists say that there can be objects more bizarre and cobbled together than you could possibly imagine. But we've been down this ontological realism route before, and we know that nothing good comes of it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a far more reasonable way of saying how many objects there are here. And that is, it depends. There are no absolute quantities in the world, because reality doesn't come pre-packaged with a certain kind of independent structure. There are only quantities relative to the concept.
So how did you get... So it's completely arbitrary that there are 3 apples there. There might have been 17 apples, right? Apple, apple, apple. I said apple three times, cognized apple 3 times, while they're all the other apples are present while I cognize one of them, right? So I say 3 apples. So did you buy 18 apples? Excuse me. And now there's 3, or did you buy 2 apples and now there's 3? No, you bought fucking 3 apples, I suppose, right? And there's 3 apples there, right? I mean, yeah, you can cut it up in little pieces, but then there are just these pieces then, right? I don't understand why it has to be so complicated. It seems to me like I need to make this complicated so I can tell you why I can't get to an answer, right? But I spent 45 minutes telling you I can't get to an answer.
We use to structure the world of experience. Here's what I mean. If you ask me how many objects there are in front of me, I can only give you an answer once I know what concept I'm using to count things. If the concept is the concept of being an apple, then it's simple. I know how to count apples. The answer is 3. 1, 2, 3. If, however, the concept is top or bottom apple halves, then there are 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Or consider this deck of cards.
No, you're counting an imagination there, right? That which you're counting, if you're counting halves, that's imagined. That's your imagination running wild and confusing yourself, right? It's unnecessarily complication, right? So I don't understand what you're trying to do here other than confuse yourself and the world around you. to distrusting anything, everything, not trusting in anything. I fucking hate this bullshit, man, right?
How many things are there? Once again, it's going to depend on the concepts I use to count things.
But what's a thing? What's a thing? You haven't defined the thing. Now it's a thing, not an object. God, man.
If I'm using the concept of complete decks, the answer is 1. If I'm using the concept of playing cards, the answer is 52. If I'm using the concept of suits, the answer is 4. And if I'm using the concept of fundamental particles, the answer is lots. The deck of cards example was used by, you may have guessed, Frege. And he used it to show that quantity was not a property of objects themselves. He thought that quantity only came into play once we had carved reality up with our concepts.
Yeah.
And that quantity was actually a property of the concepts we used to carve reality and not of objects themselves. Concepts that can be used to count things this way are called sortal concepts. And you understand a sortal concept when you know what it takes to be one of those things and how to count them. For example, you know what the sortal concept apple is once you can recognize an apple and know how to count them. One way to go from here.
No, but you don't have to know how to count them. What do you mean count? Say the number, right? You can have an idea without of counting and a number of items of the same kind, if even if you don't have a language, right? You know, can you count otherwise? I can cognize apple, apple, apple. I can point and recognize there are two other of the same kind. When I'm pointing to this one and I point to this one, there are two others, and pointing to this one, there are still two others, right? But the others were the ones I pointed at before. So I'm pointing 1, 2, 3 sort of in a way, right? Without stating the number or counting the numbers, right? You don't have to understand counting in order to cognize. There's some foundational confusion here, right?
Is to say that it is our sortal concepts that carves reality up into objects and provides it with a structure it doesn't have in and of itself. Once those concepts have done their structure...
But what do you mean structure now, right? There's a word that has been mentioned for structure. Well, if it's blue here and then it's red over here, and then the borderline between the blue and the red is the borderline between two concepts or two cognitions. Well, my telephone is not the same as my glass, so there's black with my telephone and transparent at the other concept. So there's structure here, phone here, glass here, right? It could be mixed up. I have no idea why I'm experiencing this and cognizing this. I just am, right? So, I mean, it's... there's a problem in how much do you think that you're adding to the picture and how much is created in the picture without you adding anything to it. And do you need to add something to understand the picture? Or is some of the understanding already added to the picture before you think you understand it, right? That might be a necessary thing you need to dive into.
Actually work, then and only then there can be definitive answers about quantities of objects. This idea heavily suggests that quantities are not things we encounter in the world itself, but are only parts of the way we mentally structure that world with our concepts. Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, go even further and say that this explains the certainty we find in mathematics. Mathematics isn't...
Yeah, because you don't need the objects in order to juggle around the term number 3, right? You can just, you can just do whatever you want with the idea of 3, right? That's why numbers are dissociated from your experiences, but it's because of experiences you have numbers. Otherwise you wouldn't have numbers, I would say, right? So yeah, you can abstract numbers and juggle them around without having if you're juggling around the number 1 million, you don't need to have 1 million apples in order to do that juggling with the number, right? You can work with it on an abstract level.
It isn't about the world itself, it's about the way we mentally structure the world with our concepts. Because mathematical truths are about the structure of our thought, they are independent of how the world happens to be. And that is why, he says, we don't discover them by going out into the world.
No, but then you have to understand the metaphysics of Immanuel Kant. He's talking about you can't get, if there is, or maybe he said there is an external world, and he didn't recognize the problem of having to argue why you think there is something beyond your experiences or his noumena, right? But he says all you have access to is your phenomena. If you have access to it, it must be a phenomena, right? There is no backdoor way to noumena, in my opinion, right? As much as you probably wanted, or Bernardo Kastrup arguing, yeah. But, Schopenhauer found out that you are the exception from the noumena. You are a noumena itself. No, you're not, right? That's bullshit. If you experience something, that is a part of that experience, right? If there's some connection between you and your actions in the world, so to say, then they can't be accessed, and that's why you are probably, that's one of the things that falls out of that is the problem of getting to an idea of free will. I think about something and then some action of mine is performed, but I can't see the connection between my idea of what I wanted to do and the actual action that coincides with the understanding of what I wanted to do. But then you axiomatically could say, well, I work from the idea of a free will, then fine, right? That's my approach. But it's all an experience. Otherwise, what would you call it? Right? It's a phenomena. Let's use Kant's term, right? If it's not a phenomena, then what is it then? And then is it about coming up with new terms in order to violate the borderline between the noumena and the phenomena, right? So I've at this point, after a few, misgivings of my own through the years here, at this point I don't understand why it's hard for somebody who should actually understand these aspects to still not apparently understand the significance of what a guy like Immanuel Kant said in this regard, right? I don't understand the confusion here.
And doing experiments. So far, I have argued...
Bringing what together? Because all you have done is saying there's somebody not doing it right. And then you start counting your tabletop apples, and then you're bringing what together? If you're only presented something that this doesn't work, and that doesn't work, and this might work, but it doesn't seem like it works. So you're bringing this shit together? It's like if you're building a house and say, I'm not going to use wood. But I might want to use bricks, but I'm not sure. And I might want to use this pile of dirt over there, right? And these twigs. No, I'm not going to use twigs, because twigs are stupid, right? Okay, I'm bringing it all together so I can build my house. What? God.
Argued for two main theses. The first was that truth bearers are thoughts. They are the things that we believe, and the things that we say, and the meanings of our sentences. Further, I have claimed that, although thoughts are public entities, they are nevertheless in the mind. Second, I have argued that
the mind? What mind? Where? What is it? I mean, it's like it's a little minutiae, and now it's sort of the big lines. It's mind, and there's sentences and meaning and mind, and bringing it together here, right? It's jumping from very small steps into, I'm talking about the whole universe now, right?
It's not a feature of reality independently of our theories and ways of conceptualizing it. Rather, structure is something imposed on reality in our theories and language.
No, but imposed. Now he's talking about that reality again, without clarifying where the hell it is, or what it is. If you're experiencing an apple, are you saying that's reality? And if you're saying that's reality when you experience apple, what are you referring to? Are you referring to the apple or something else? If the apple is reality, then there's no other realm where there's anything you can talk about, right? Because that's then the reality. But if you're not talking about the apple as reality, then what are you talking about? And why do you think it's there? Explain yourself, argue, give me an argument for that potential external world beyond your apple.
Used to describe them. And since structure is required for counting things and for saying what exists, the features we typically associate with matters of fact, such as what exists and how many things there are not features of the world independently of language theories and concepts, but are instead features of language theories and concepts. Putting these insights together, the most natural thing to do is to say, as Frege does, that facts are thought.
Okay, let me just cut this short here, right? Why are these philosophers who seem to be so confused about everything? There's no settlement of what it means to be true. There's no settlement of what it means to know. There's no settlement on metaphysics of any kind, ontology of any kind. Nobody has come up with a functional moral principle. But still, to the best of my understanding, there are governments everywhere who basically telling people what to do, stealing their shit, saying, you have 3 apples, I need to take 2 of them, right? Are you going to say, no, there are a gazillion quarters of apples or whatever, right? And you can't measure it like that. Go to your government and say, no, we philosophers, we're still working on this shit, right? You can't take anything because we don't know how many objects there are. We haven't agreed upon it yet. Why don't you go to your fucking government and say, you can't count objects of money, right? So you can't steal anything yet before we have settled how much money we have, because we don't know about the objects, right? And we haven't found any functional moral principle yet. So if you're going to steal people's shit, we can't figure out whether or not it's immoral or not, right? Why don't you go that route and tell, rather than sit here talk to me, go to your fucking government and tell them, no, philosophers have never agreed upon anything that government apparently are working from. Why don't you do that?
Facts are the true thoughts. Facts are structured entities, just like thoughts are. And, just like thoughts, that means that facts are public entities that exist within the eternal mind. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that if we accept that facts are in the mind, and if we accept Wittgenstein's claim that the world is the totality of facts, then we can establish idealism. So, does this mean I can now take Wittgenstein's Tractarian step and establish idealism? Unfortunately, no. I don't think that facts are the totality of the world. For me, the idea that reality is merely factual is an impoverished view. Not all conscious experience is contained within thought. We also experience a world of our senses. We experience emotions, desire.
Why didn't you start with this? Why did you start with the senses and emotion, right? Maybe that's a good place to start with ontology. But isn't that what you are sort of, no, I have my own experiences. But isn't that what you're supposed to philosophize about? What you're thinking and what you're experiencing, and how to classify it and categorize it and find interdependencies and so on. Can you have an elephant without any qualia, for instance? Right? So do you need to have some qualia, at least one qualia, in order to have elephant? I would suppose so. So there's interdependencies, right? This settled external world where somebody out there supposedly says there's an external settled world out there with governing laws and so on, right? And you're just having a snapshot of it, you poor little peasant, right? That's also an experience of yours, right? A professor is just an experience. You have been told is this kind of experience that you have to observe this way or another, right?
Will, moral duties, and so forth. I haven't even begun to integrate these aspects of human experience into an idealist worldview. But when I do, they won't fundamentally be facts. Don't get me wrong, I am what I think is best described as an idealist.
I simply cannot grasp, and maybe it's a shortcoming of mine, I cannot grasp how he can put these pieces together and get idealism. Right? I don't understand the structure of this argument, right? First of all, he spends 50 minutes, almost, or 40 minutes or so, telling me about bad philosophies, or at least a lot of bad philosophy, where after presenting it says, that doesn't really work, does it now? And then he says something like, and then I start counting, but I don't know how many objects there are. Okay, let me bring it all together. Idealism. But this midstream, you crawl your way through the exhaust pipe of your car in order to get to the steering wheel. It's the wrong direction, right? It's like you have to start with the motor, and you start with the foundations, right? And then get to all the other shit and argue how you do that. Oh, I'm not buying this. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that everything he's done is presented here is bad philosophy, but the way he put things together, he's actually not putting anything together, and it's like also like, well, I'm taking this compact disc and this glass, and now I have an ostrich. It's like, I don't think you do.
And the view that facts are thoughts in the mind is a central pillar of my idealism. It's just not the whole story. So far, I haven't stated what my position on truth is. I've just said that it grounds itself and doesn't rely on notions of simplicity, elegance, or strength. But a clear understanding of the notion of truth is required for any idealist position. At least I think so. Nor have I talked about the clear link between the world of thought and the world we experience through our senses, which is also highly relevant. But
what? Is it a different world? What? It almost sounds like, yeah, and by the way, there's also the world you experience with your senses. But isn't that the world we're talking about? I mean, or you at least have referenced, you pointed to some fucking apples in front of you, didn't you? I mean, how many worlds are there here, right? It just floats. By the way, that's also something I experience. I have some colors and some sound,
But discussion of these important topics will have to wait for other videos. There simply isn't enough time to cover everything at once. What I can say so far is that facts are in the mind, and I consider this to be a big step forward in the idealist direction. For information about my views...
Okay, but you don't explain. Yeah, they're over there. But what are they? But they're over there. What is a bicycle? It's over there. Can you define what a bicycle is? It's over there. God damn it, man. This guy is a bit of a weirdo, right? Okay. I mean, I think between the lines, I put forth how I understand these aspects. It's not as superbly complicated as this guy makes it, right? I have no idea where he's trying to go with this, other than he wants to sit there and be known as somebody on YouTube, right? I mean, how old is he? 35, 40 maybe, right? Maybe he looks older than he actually is, right? I mean, if you have spent 20 years of your life philosophizing, is this how far you've got? Is this when you go and buy apples, you stand there, I don't know why. Maybe there are 7 apples here, maybe there are 4, maybe there are 2 million, 100 parts of apples here. How do I pay for this? I don't know if there's 200 money or 5,000 money in my purse, and how do you get your fucking trousers on if you don't know how many trousers there are, right? How many breasts does your fiancé have, right? Yeah, there might be 2, but in some ways there are 5. Okay, see you in the next one.